Dear friend, pull up a chair and pour yourself some coffee. This is a story about two people who found each other when neither was looking about, cornbread shared in hard times, and kindness given without expecting anything back. My grandmother would have called it providence. I reckon she was right. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a place when hope has packed its bags and left. I reckon most folks my age know that silence we've met it at hospital bedsides, at graveyards, at kitchen tables where bad news was delivered over cold coffee. Clara Danvers knew it too. Though she was young yet, she'd grown up with it in the cramped boarding house rooms of St. Louis, in the space between her mother's labored breaths during those final months. But standing on the weathered platform of Thornfield Station, watching the train shrink to a dark speck against the amber horizon, she discovered a new variety of quiet altogether. This was the silence of being completely, utterly alone in a land she didn't know, waiting for a man she'd never met, clutching a letter full of promises that now felt thin as the paper they were written on. The station master squinted at the letter like it might bite him. "Mercer, you say—" He turned the paper over, held it up to the fading light. His fingers were stained with tobacco, nails cracked and dirty. "S. Mercer? That's what it says." Clara kept her voice steady. She'd learned young that showing weakness was like bleeding in front of wolves. It only made things worse. "He was supposed to meet me here." The smell of coal smoke still hung in the air, sharp and acrid, mixing with the red dust that coated everything. The locomotive's whistle echoed somewhere down the valley, growing fainter. Metal creaked as the tracks settled in the afternoon heat. The old man scratched his jaw. Gray stubble rasped against his palm. "Well, ma'am, I know who Silas Mercer is. Everybody in these parts knows the Mercer name. Owns the Star Ranch biggest spread between here and the territorial line." Clara's heart lifted, then sank again when she saw his face. "But I ain't seen nobody from Star Ranch come through today. Not yesterday, neither." He handed the letter back, and something in his eyes looked almost like pity. "You sure you got the right day?" She unfolded the letter again. "Read the date for the 100th time. June 14th. Today was June 14th. She pulled her mother's small brass watch from her pocket, the one keepsake she'd never sell, no matter how hungry she got, and checked the date again. The watch had belonged to her grandmother before that, its face yellowed with age but still keeping perfect time. June 14th. She'd counted the days on the train like a child counting to Christmas. "I'm sure—" The station master shrugged the slow, heavy shrug of a man who'd seen too many disappointed faces on this platform. "Could be he got held up. Ranch work don't keep a no schedule. Could be tomorrow. Could be— How far is it to town?" He blinked at the interruption. "Beg pardon, Sal. The town. How far me? Crestwood's about 10 miles west." He gestured vaguely toward where the sun was bleeding into the hills. "But ma'am, it'll be dark in 2 hours. And that road ain't— Is there a shortcut?" The old man's eyebrows climbed toward his hat. He studied her for a long moment, this thin woman in her faded calico dress. Dust already settling in the creases of her face, one battered valise at her feet. Whatever he saw made him sigh. "There's a path through Saddleback Canyon. Cuts 3 miles off the journey." He pointed northwest, toward a gap in the low hills. "Follow the creek bed till you see a split rock looks like a broken tooth. Bear left there. But I wouldn't recommend to— Thank you kindly." Clara picked up her valise. The leather handle was worn smooth from her mother's hands, then her own. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it: 2 dresses, 1 wool shawl, her mother's herb journal with its pressed flowers and careful notes, a tin-type photograph too faded to make out the faces anymore. "Ma'am!" The station master's voice stopped her at the edge of the platform. "You sure about this next train comes through Thursday? You could wait here. Send word to the ranch. I've done enough waiting, I reckon." She stepped off the platform onto the packed dirt road. The ground was hard and red, cracked like old pottery. The smell of sage and dry grass filled her nose, strange scents. Nothing like the soot and river smell of St. Louis. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Clara touched the watch in her pocket, felt the familiar weight of it against her hip. Her mother had wound that watch every night before bed, right up until her hands grew too weak to turn the stem. Keep moving forward. Clara girl, her mother used to say. The Lord helps those who help themselves. Clara squared her shoulders and started walking. The canyon swallowed sound the way a well swallows stones. Clara had been walking for nearly an hour. The walls of Saddleback rose on either side, not tall, but steep enough to block the wind and trap the heat of the dying day. Sweat trickled down her back, plastering her dress to her skin. The valise grew heavier with every step. She hadn't passed another soul. No wagons, no riders. Nothing but the scrub brush and the red rock and the distant chatter of the creek the station master had mentioned. The silence pressed against her ears like cotton wool. What kind of man doesn't come to meet his bride? She'd asked herself that question 100 times since stepping off the train. The letter had been so careful, so precise. She'd read it until she could recite it from memory. Dear Miss Danvers, I am a man of few words and fewer graces, but I am honest, and I will be good to you. The West is hard country, but there is beauty here if you know where to look. I have land, a sturdy house, and need of a companion. If you are willing to take a chance on a stranger, I will meet you at Thornfield Station on June 14th. Respectfully yours, S. Mercer. 47 words. She'd staked her whole life on 47 words. Foolish girl, whispered a voice that sounded like her mother but sharper, meaner, the voice of fever and pain. What did you expect? Clara stopped walking, pressed her palm against the canyon wall to steady herself. The rock was warm from the sun, rough against her skin. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. She closed her eyes, drew a breath, let it out slow. I'm not foolish, she told the voice. I'm brave. There's a difference. She opened her eyes and kept walking. The horse appeared around the bend like a ghost. Clara froze. Her hand tightened on the valise handle, not that it would do much good as a weapon. But a body had to hold on to something. But there was no rider. The horse, a tall chestnut with a white blaze on its forehead, stood in the middle of the path, reins trailing in the dust. It watched her with large, liquid eyes, ears pricked forward. Dried foam crusted its neck. Wherever it had come from, it had been running hard. Easy, Clara murmured, stepping closer. Easy, now. The horse snorted, but didn't bolt. Its flank twitched when she reached for the reins. That's when she saw the blood. Dark stains on the saddle, smeared along the horse's right side. Too much to be from a scratch or a scrape. Clara's stomach dropped. She followed the trail of disturbed earth with her eyes, the scuff marks in the dust, the displaced stones. They led around a tumble of boulders toward a section of the canyon wall where fresh rockfall had spilled across the path. Walk away, said the sensible voice in her head. Get on the horse. Ride to town. Find help. But her mother's voice, the real one, the kind one, said something different. When you see someone in need, Clara girl, you don't walk past. That's not who we are. Her feet were already moving. The rocks were the color of dried blood in the fading light. Some were small as fists, others large as barrels. They'd come down from the canyon rim recently. She could see the fresh scar on the wall above, pale against the weathered red. She climbed over the first boulder, then the second, and stopped. A hand jutted out from beneath a slab of granite. Fingers curled toward the sky, motionless. A man's hand, broad palm, calloused fingers, a simple silver ring on the third finger. Clara dropped her valise. She scrambled over the remaining rocks, heedless of the sharp edges tearing at her dress. The man lay on his side, half buried under the slide. His face was turned away from her, but she could see the rise and fall of his chest, shallow, labored, But there, alive. He was alive. Mr. She knelt beside him, hands hovering uselessly. Mister, can you hear me? No response. His hat had fallen somewhere in the slide. Dark hair matted with blood and dust, a deep gash across his forehead, still seeping. His left leg was pinned under a rock too heavy for her to move alone. Clara sat back on her heels, looked at the fading sky, painted in shades of orange and purple, looked at the unconscious stranger. The sensible choice was still to ride for help, leave him here, find the town, bring back men with tools and horses. But the blood was still flowing from that gash, and the sun was nearly gone. And she remembered what her mother had taught her about head wounds, how the cold crept in fast once the body started giving up. Clara closed her eyes for just a moment. Lord, she prayed silently. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I can't leave him here to die. Please give me strength. She opened her eyes. She rolled up her sleeves. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. The smaller rocks came away first. Clara's fingernails split against the granite. She didn't stop. Each stone she pulled free revealed more of the man beneath her shoulder. The curve of his back, the torn fabric of what had once been a good wool shirt. The smell of blood and dust filled her nose, metallic and dry. His breathing changed, hitched. A low groan escaped his cracked lips. Hold on. She wiped her palms on her skirt, leaving dark smears. I'm getting you out. The slab pinning his leg was the problem, flat and heavy, wedged at an angle against a larger boulder. She braced her shoulder against it, pushed. Her boots scraped against loose gravel. The rock shifted barely. An inch, maybe two. Not enough. Clara repositioned herself, dug her heels into the dirt, pushed again, harder this time, until her arms shook and spots danced at the edges of her vision. The canyon walls seemed to lean in closer, trapping the last heat of the day. The slab scraped sideways. His leg came free. She collapsed against the boulder, chest heaving. Her hands were raw, bleeding in places. The copper smell of her own blood mixed with his, with the dust, with the faint sage scent carried on the evening breeze. The man's eyes opened. Gray. Pale gray, like winter sky before snow. They fixed on her face, unfocused, struggling to make sense of what they saw. His lips moved. No sound came out. Clara reached for the canteen on the horse's saddle. She'd spotted it earlier. Battered leather worn smooth with use. She unscrewed the cap, lifted his head with one hand and tipped a small amount against his mouth. He swallowed, coughed, swallowed again. Water, he rasped. I know. Easy now. Not too fast. His eyes drifted shut, opened again, fixed on her with something approaching clarity. Who? Another cough, wet and rattling. Who are you? Doesn't matter right now. She examined his leg in the dying light, swollen, already purpling at the ankle. But the bone hadn't broken through the skin. Small mercies. The gash on his forehead was worse than she'd thought. Deep enough to show white beneath the red. It needed cleaning, stitching. Things she couldn't do here in the failing dark. There's a cabin. His voice was barely a whisper now. Half-mile. Follow the creek. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp in her arms. Clara looked at the horse, looked at the unconscious stranger, looked at the last sliver of sun vanishing behind the canyon rim. Half a mile, in the dark, with a man twice her weight who might not live till morning. Getting him onto the horse nearly broke her. Clara hooked her arms under his shoulders, pulled. His boots dragged furrows in the dirt, leaving dark trails in the fading light. Dead weight, that's what folks called it. And now she understood why. Every muscle in her back screamed. Her knees buckled twice before she managed to prop him against a boulder. The horse stood patient, watching with those liquid eyes. Its breath came warm against Clara's cheek, smelling of grass and dust. "Come on now." Clara grabbed the man's belt with one hand, his shirt collar with the other. "You got to help me. Just a little." Something flickered across his face. Consciousness. Maybe. Or just pain. His good leg moved, found the stirrup. Clara shoved from below, teeth gritted, arms burning, and somehow she would never quite remember how he ended up draped across the saddle like a sack of grain. She took the reins and started walking. One step, then another. The creek bed stretched ahead, pale stones glowing faintly in the last purple light of evening. Half a mile. He'd said half a mile. The night sounds began, crickets chirping in the brush, an owl calling somewhere up the canyon, the soft rush of water over rocks. Clara kept her eyes on the ground, watching for roots and holes that might trip her in the darkness. "Please," she prayed silently, "please let me find this cabin." The cabin appeared between one blink and the next. Or maybe Clara had simply stopped seeing anything beyond the horse's hooves, the rhythm of placing one foot in front of the other. Her arms ached from holding the reins. Her throat was raw with thirst. But there it was, a dark shape hunched against the hillside, barely visible against the trees. The creek gurgled past its western wall, black water catching fragments of starlight. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows. Abandoned, just as he'd said. Clara pushed open the door. The hinges shrieked a sound that set her teeth on edge. The smell hit her first old wood, mouse droppings, something musty and closed in. Beneath that, the faint char of a long-dead fire, cold ash and creosote. She fumbled along the mantel, fingers brushing rough wood and dust until they found a candle stub, matches beside it, the box damp but not ruined. The match head scraped, flared. The flame sputtered to life, throwing shadows across the single room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, hand-stacked and blackened with years of smoke. A wooden cot with a straw mattress, the ticking stained and lumpy. A table, two chairs with one leg shorter than the others. An iron pot hanging from a hook over the cold hearth. It smelled like a place that had been forgotten. But it had walls. It had a roof. Even if she could see gaps where the stars peeked through, it would have to do. The man's forehead burned against her palm. Clara had dragged him inside, inch by painful inch, and laid him on the cot. His skin was the color of old candle wax, except for two spots of fever red high on his cheeks. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but the edges were ragged, angry, already starting to swell. She needed water, needed fire, needed light to work by. The creek was 20 steps from the door. Clara found the dented copper pot, carried it to the water's edge. The creek ran cold and clear, numbing her fingers as she filled the pot. She carried it back, water sloshing against her skirt, and set it by the hearth, kindling first. She found dry sticks stacked beside the fireplace left by whoever had lived here last, months or years ago, crumpled leaves for tinder. The match caught on the second try, and flame crawled up through the kindling, crackling and popping as it found the larger wood. Heat crept into the cabin. Light flickered across the walls, steadier now than the single candle. Clara tore strips from her petticoat. The cotton was worn thin from washing, but clean. She dipped a strip in the warming water, wrung it out, and pressed it against the wound on his forehead. The man flinched. His eyes flew open wild, unseeing. The eyes of a man trapped in nightmare. "Easy now." Clara held his shoulders down. "You're safe. Lie still." He fought her for a moment, his strength surprising. Then it drained out of him, and he sank back against the mattress, chest heaving. Clara cleaned the gash with careful strokes, the way her mother had taught her. The water in the pot turned pink, then red. She dumped it outside, refilled it, started again. The wound was deep but clean, no dirt embedded in the flesh, no fragments of rock. Small mercies. His leg worried her more. The ankle had swollen to twice its normal size. The skin stretched tight and shiny. Purple bruising spread up toward his knee. She ran her fingers along the bone, pressing gently. He groaned but didn't wake. No grinding. No unnatural angles. Sprained. Badly sprained. Maybe torn, but not broken. She needed something to draw out the fever. Something for the swelling. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Clear as Sunday church bells, mugwort for wounds. Clara girl, yarrow for fever. Look for the silver-green leaves by running water. Clara took the candle and went back outside. The creek bank yielded what she needed. Mugwort grew in thick clumps near the water's edge, its leaves soft and silvery in the candlelight. Clara gathered handfuls, stuffed them into her apron pockets. Found yarrow, too, its flat white flower heads nodding in the darkness. Back inside, she searched the cabin until she found a wooden bowl. Cracked, but serviceable. A smooth river stone served as a pestle. She crushed the mugwort leaves until they released their sharp, bitter smell, the smell of her mother's kitchen, of childhood, of being safe and cared for. The man hadn't moved. His breathing came fast and shallow now. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, his temples. Clara packed the poultice against his forehead, bound it with another strip of petticoat. Then she turned to his leg, wrapped the crushed yarrow around the ankle, tied it firm, but not too tight. She heated more water, poured some into a tin cup she'd found on the shelf, added a few yarrow leaves, let them steep until the water turned pale gold. Here. She lifted his head, held the cup to his lips. Drink this. It'll help with the fever. He swallowed without opening his eyes. Once, twice. The warm liquid ran down his chin, but some of it went down his throat. Clara eased him back onto the pillow, a rolled-up blanket. Musty and moth-eaten, but better than nothing. Then she sat down on the floor beside the cot, her back against the rough wood, and waited. The fever peaked somewhere in the deep hours of the night. Clara lost track of time. She only knew the rhythm: check his forehead, wring out the cloth, press it against his burning skin. Again. Again. His body shook with chills even as heat radiated off him in waves. He muttered words she couldn't understand. Names. Maybe. Once. He grabbed her wrist with startling strength, his eyes open but seeing something far away. I'm here, Clara said, though she didn't know why. I'm here. His grip loosened. His eyes closed. She changed the poultice twice, fed the fire when it burned low, the wood crackling and popping in the silence. The darkness outside the window shifted from black to gray to the pale pink of approaching dawn. And slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice his breathing steadied. His skin cooled beneath her palm. The trembling stopped. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her shoulders ached. Her eyes burned from the smoke and the sleepless hours, but the worst had passed. He woke with the first true light of morning. Clara was dozing against the cot, her neck bent at an angle that would ache for days. The sound of his voice jerked her upright. Where? He coughed, dry and rasping. Where am I? Safe. She reached for the water pot, poured some into the tin cup. A cabin by the creek. You told me about it before you passed out. He took the cup with shaking hands, drank. His gray eyes moved around the room, taking in the fire, the bandages, the strips of torn petticoat drying on the hearthstones. You did all this? Clara didn't answer. The question didn't need one. He studied her face for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, confusion giving way to something harder to read. Who are you? Someone who was walking through that canyon. She took the empty cup from his hands. Your turn. Who are you? The pause lasted a beat too long. Eli, he said finally. Name's Eli. Clara watched his eyes when he said it, watched the way they slid sideways, just for a heartbeat, before meeting hers again. Her mother had always said Clara had a gift for reading faces, for knowing when someone was telling the truth, and when they were selling snake oil. This man, this Eli, was hiding something. She didn't know what. Didn't know why a wounded stranger in the middle of nowhere would have reason to lie about something as simple as his own name. But she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't telling her the whole truth. The cornbread had gone stale 3 days ago. Clara unwrapped it from the cotton cloth, the same cloth her mother had used for Sunday baking, still carrying the faint ghost of her kitchen. The edges crumbled under her fingers, dry and yellow-brown. She'd been rationing the squares since St. Louis, one small piece each morning, making them last. Now only 2 remained, and her stomach had been hollow since yesterday. She thought of her mother standing at the old cast-iron stove, mixing cornmeal and buttermilk in the chipped blue bowl. The smell of it baking had filled their tiny rooms every Sunday afternoon, warm and sweet. The one luxury they allowed themselves. Always share what you have, Clara girl, her mother used to say. The Lord sees what we do when no one's watching. Clara broke the larger piece in half, then in half again, weighed the portions in her palms. The man on the cot, Eli, if that was really his name, watched her with those gray eyes. He'd been awake for 2 hours now, propped against the wall, his bandaged legs stretched out before him. He hadn't complained, hadn't asked for food or water beyond what she offered. Just watched. Clara crossed the cabin, her boots scuffing against the packed dirt floor. She placed the larger portion in his hand. He looked down at it, looked back up at her. The cornbread sat in his palm like something precious, like something he didn't quite know what to do with. Eat, Clara said. You need the strength more than I do. What about you? I've got mine. She returned to her spot by the fire, settled onto the floor with her back against the warm hearthstones. The cornbread was dry in her mouth, crumbly. The sweetness faded to almost nothing. She chewed anyway, slowly, making it last. Each swallow landed in her empty stomach like a pebble in a dry well. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the creek. A mockingbird called outside, its song bright and insistent through the gaps in the cabin walls. Eli ate slowly, methodically. When he finished, he brushed the crumbs from his fingers and fixed his eyes on her face. You were walking through that canyon alone. Not a question. Clara nodded anyway. Where were you headed? She reached into her valise, pulled out the cloth bag of dried apples. 6 left. She counted them twice to make certain, then divided them 3 and 3. Crestwood, she said. Eventually. Eventually. I was supposed to be met at Thornfield Station. She crossed to the cot, dropped 3 apples into his palm. The dried fruit was brown and wrinkled, but still good. No one came. Eli turned the apples over in his hand. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Met by who? A man named Mercer. Clara returned to her spot by the fire, bit into an apple. The sweetness was faint, concentrated by the drying, but still there a taste of last autumn's orchards. He sent for me. Sent for you how? Mail-order bride. She kept her eyes on the flames. I answered an advertisement in a St. Louis paper. He wrote back. 3 letters, then a train ticket. The apple turned dry in her mouth. She forced herself to swallow. And he didn't come. No. The fire popped. Sparks spiraled up toward the chimney, orange and gold against the dark stone. Clara watched them rise and die. The station master said this Mercer owns the biggest ranch in these parts, she said. Star Ranch. He called it, you know it. Something changed in Eli's face. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there before. I've heard of it. Then you know more than I do. Clara bit into another apple. Chewed, swallowed. All I know is 47 words in a letter. Turns out that wasn't much to stake a life on. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's single window, thick with dust motes that danced like tiny stars. Clara had changed his bandages twice. The wound on his forehead was closing well, no redness spreading outward, no smell of sickness. His ankle remained swollen, but the bruising had shifted from deep purple to yellow-green at the edges. Healing, slowly but surely. She worked in silence, her hands moving through the familiar motions. Crush the herbs, mix the poultice, clean the wound, wrap it fresh. Eli watched. It should have made her uneasy, those gray eyes following her every movement. But something in his watching felt different from the men she'd known in St. Louis, the boarders who'd let their gazes linger too long, the foreman at the laundry who'd stood too close. Eli watched the way her hands moved, the way she crushed the herbs, the way she checked his pulse against the rhythm of her own heartbeat. He watched like he was trying to figure something out. Where did you learn all that? His voice broke the silence, rough from disuse. Learn what? The herbs, the bandages. He gestured at his wrapped ankle. You knew exactly what to do. Clara poured water into the pot, set it over the fire to warm. My mother taught me. She couldn't afford doctors, so she learned to make do without. She taught you well. She taught me everything she could. Clara stirred the water, watched the surface ripple and settle. She passed when I was 17. Consumption. 3 months of coughing and fever, and then one morning she just stopped. The words came out before she could catch them. She hadn't meant to say so much, hadn't talked about her mother to anyone since leaving St. Louis. But something about this cabin, this stranger, this strange suspended time between one life and the next, had loosened her tongue. Eli was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. The mockingbird sang. Your father, he asked finally. Never knew him. Never knew his name. Clara pulled the pot from the fire, poured some into the tin cup. Mama worked in a textile mill. That's all she ever told me about him. She brought him the water. Their fingers brushed when he took the cup, his rough and calloused, hers red and chapped from work. His hands were working hands, hands that had held reins and tools and rope. So you came west, he said, all alone. Was there another way? The question sat between them, heavy with everything it didn't say. Clara took the empty cup back, returned it to its place on the shelf. Most folks wouldn't have stopped in that canyon, Eli said. A woman alone, strange man bleeding in the dirt. Most folks would have ridden for town, wouldn't have blamed them none, either. Clara shrugged. I reckon most folks have better sense than me. I'm serious. He shifted on the cot, wincing as his ankle moved. You could have left me there. No one would have known. I would have known. That's not. He stopped, swallowed. What I mean is, why did you stay? She thought about the question, really thought, the way her mother had taught her to think about important things. Because you were hurt, she said finally. And I was there. It's not more complicated than that. Eli tried to stand near sunset. Clara saw him moving from the corner of her eye, hands braced against the rough plank wall. Good leg taking his weight. She was across the cabin before he'd straightened fully, her hand on his arm. What in the world do you think you're doing? Testing it. His face had gone pale with the effort. Sweat beaded at his temples. "Can't stay flat on my back forever. You can stay off your feet for more than one day." He ignored her, shifted his weight to the injured leg just slightly. His breath caught. The muscles in his jaw went tight as wire. But he didn't fall. "See," the word came out thin, strained. "I'm all right." Clara kept her hand on his arm. Through the worn fabric of his sleeve, she could feel the tremor running through him, the effort it took just to stay upright. "You're stubborn as a mule," she said. "That's not the same as all right." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough. "Fair point." She helped him lower himself back onto the cot. He moved carefully, deliberately, a man used to being in control of his body, unused to having it fail him. When he was settled, he closed his eyes. His breathing slowly steadied. "Thank you," he said without looking at her. "For everything. The bandages, the food." A pause. "For not leaving me in that canyon to die." Clara gathered the empty cup, the used bandages, the mortar with its residue of crushed herbs. Small tasks to keep her hands busy while her mind worked. "You'd have done the same." Eli opened his eyes, looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Would I?" The question startled her. She turned, cup in hand, to find him watching her with that strange intensity. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know anything about you." The fire crackled. Outside, the light was fading, painting the window amber and gold. "You're right," Eli said quietly. "You don't." Clara waited for more. An explanation, a confession, something. But he only turned his face toward the wall and closed his eyes, leaving her alone with the dying fire and the growing dark, and the certain knowledge that the man she'd pulled from that rock slide was carrying something heavy, something he had no intention of sharing. 3 days in the cabin, and Eli could walk. Not well, not far. But he could hobble from the cot to the door without Clara's arm beneath his shoulder, could stand at the threshold and look out at the creek, the trees, the slice of blue sky visible through the canyon walls. Clara watched him from the hearth, where she was grinding yarrow for a fresh poultice. His back was straight, despite the limp. His shoulders squared even when pain pulled at the corners of his mouth. A man used to standing tall, she reckoned. A man who didn't take kindly to being brought low. "I can help," he said without turning around. "With the water, the firewood, something. You can rest." "I've rested plenty." He turned then, and the morning light caught his face, the healing gash, the stubble darkening his jaw, those gray eyes that gave away nothing and saw everything. "Please." The word seemed to cost him something. "Let me be useful." Clara set down the mortar, wiped her hands on her apron. "Fine. You can fill the water pot. But if you tumble into that creek, I'm not fishing you out." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Fair enough." He didn't fall. Clara watched from the doorway as he made his way down the bank, the wooden bucket hanging from his good hand. His bad leg dragged slightly, and twice he stopped to steady himself against a cottonwood trunk. But he reached the creek, filled the bucket, carried it back without spilling more than a few drops. By the time he reached the cabin, his face was gray with effort. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there before, something fierce and hard-won. She took the bucket from his hands. "Sit down before you fall down." He sat, didn't argue. Clara poured some of the water into the iron pot, set it over the fire to heat. The rest she left in the bucket by the door. They'd need it for drinking, for washing, for the 100 small tasks that kept them alive in this place. "You're good at this," Eli said from the cot. "At what?" "Getting by." He was watching her again. That way he had making do with next to nothing. Most folks would have given up by now. Clara stirred the pot, watched the surface ripple and settle. Crying doesn't put food on the table. My mama taught me that. She sounds like a wise woman. She was practical. That's all. She knew we couldn't afford to fall apart. The fire crackled. Steam began to rise from the water. Clara added the crushed yarrow, watched the liquid turn pale green, breathed in the sharp medicinal smell. "You don't talk much about yourself," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. She kept her eyes on the pot, stirring, stirring. Nothing worth telling. Everybody's got a story. Some stories are better left alone. Clara lifted her head, met his gaze across the small cabin. The distance between them couldn't have been more than 10 feet, but it felt like a canyon. "You know mine," she said. "The mill, my mother, the letters, the train." She set down the stirring stick. "I've told you just about everything there is to tell." Eli's jaw tightened. He looked away, toward the window, toward the morning light falling gold across the packed dirt floor. "I grew up on a ranch," he said finally. "Worked cattle since I was old enough to sit a saddle. It's all I know. That's not a story. That's a sentence." His eyes came back to hers. Something moved in their depths, irritation. Maybe. Or something deeper, something that looked almost like guilt. "What do you want from me, Clara?" The question hung in the dusty air. Clara thought about it, really thought, the way her mother had taught her. "Nothing," she said at last. "I don't want anything from you." She turned back to the fire, lifted the pot, poured the warm yarrow water into a clean cloth. She could feel his eyes on her back as she crossed to the cot, knelt beside him, began unwrapping the bandage on his ankle. "What did you want from him?" Eli's voice was quiet. "The man who sent for you. This Mercer fellow." Clara's hand stilled on the bandage. "A roof over my head, 4 walls, a place where I belonged. That's all. What else would there be?" She peeled away the last layer of cloth. The swelling had gone down considerable. The bruising was fading to yellow at the edges, the angry purple giving way to something gentler. Another few days, and he'd be walking proper. Another few days, and he'd leave. "Most women want more than that," Eli said. "Security, comfort, money." Clara pressed the warm cloth against his ankle. He flinched but didn't pull away. "Most women have choices." She wrapped the fresh bandage with practiced hands, the motions automatic after so many days. "I had a boarding house room I couldn't pay for, and a job at a laundry that barely kept me fed. When you're drowning, you don't ask whether the rope's made of silk or hemp. You grab hold and hang on." She tied off the bandage, sat back on her heels. Eli was watching her with that strange look again, like she was something he couldn't quite figure out. "And if the man who threw you that rope turned out to be different than you expected?" Clara stood, gathered the soiled bandages. "Then I'd deal with that when it happened." Night fell slow over the canyon. The light didn't fade so much as thicken, turning gold to amber to gray to black. Clara fed the fire, checked Eli's bandages one last time, then settled into her spot on the floor near the hearth. The blanket she'd claimed was thin and moth-eaten, smelling of dust and old wool, but it was better than nothing, and exhaustion had long since stopped being particular about comfort. She curled onto her side, tucked the blanket beneath her chin, and closed her eyes. Sleep came in pieces, scraps of dreams she couldn't hold on to her mother's face, the rattle of train wheels, red dust rising in clouds beneath a copper sky. She drifted up and down, aware of the fire's crackle, the creek's endless murmur, the soft rhythm of Eli's breathing from the cot. And then, in the deep middle of the night, She woke. Something had changed. The quality of the silence, maybe, or a shift in the air. Crickets sang outside, loud and constant. An owl called somewhere up the canyon, a low, mournful sound. The cabin walls creaked as they settled, old wood talking to itself in the darkness. Clara lay still, her eyes adjusting to the dark. Moonlight streamed through the cracks in the wall, painting pale stripes across the floor. And in that light, she could see Eli. He was sitting up on the cot, his back against the wall, his eyes open and fixed on something she couldn't see. His hands were clasped in his lap, knuckles white. And even in the dimness, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man carrying something too heavy to set down. Clara watched him through her lashes, keeping her breathing slow and even, pretending sleep, wondering what kept him awake when the rest of the world had gone quiet. His lips moved. She couldn't hear the words, barely a whisper, meant for no one but himself. But she caught fragments, shapes of sound in the darkness. Should have told her. Can't. She doesn't know. His head turned. Toward her. Clara held her breath, kept her eyes nearly closed, prayed the moonlight wasn't bright enough to give her away. Eli looked at her for a long moment. The fire had burned down to embers, casting his face in shadow and faint red glow. She couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell whether he knew she was awake. Then he turned away, faced the wall. His shoulders rose and fell with a breath that might have been a sigh, or might have been something closer to surrender. Clara waited until his breathing changed, until she was sure he'd finally drifted into sleep. Then she opened her eyes fully, stared at the ceiling where moonlight made patterns through the gaps, and turned the question over and over in her mind. She doesn't know. Know what? What was this man hiding? What burden was he carrying that kept him awake in the small hours, whispering confessions to the empty air, and when the truth finally came out as truth always did? Sooner or later, which side of it would she find herself standing on? 5 days, and the cabin had started to feel like something close to home. Clara knew where the floorboards creaked, the spot near the door, the loose plank by the hearth. She knew which corner of the fireplace drew the best draft, how the morning light fell through the window in a golden slant that reached the cot by mid-morning. She knew the sound of Eli's breathing when he slept slow and deep, like water moving over stones, and the different sound when he was awake, but pretending not to be. Small things, the kind that accumulated without asking permission. She was sorting herbs at the table when Eli pushed himself up from the cot and walked, actually walked, without the wall to lean on to the cabin door. "I need some air," he said, not asking, stating. Clara set down the yarrow stems. "Your ankle is fine." He pushed the door open. Sunlight flooded in, warm and bright, carrying the smell of pine and creek water. "Better than fine. I need to move around some." She watched him step outside. His gait was still uneven, favoring the bad leg, but the limp had faded to barely a hitch in his stride. A week ago, she'd worried he might never walk right again. Bodies were peculiar things, fragile and stubborn in equal measure. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, gathered the herbs into a cloth bundle, and followed him out. The creek caught the midday sun and scattered it into 1,000 bright pieces. Eli stood at the water's edge, his face tilted up toward the sky. His eyes were closed, and for a moment he looked almost peaceful. The hard lines of his face softened, the tension gone from his shoulders. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the brush, its song bright and complicated. The water rushed past, cold and clear, tumbling over smooth stones worn round by years of flowing. Then he heard her footsteps on the gravel and turned, and whatever she'd seen slipped away behind his usual careful expression. "Show me," he said. Clara stopped a few feet away. "Show you what?" "The plants." He gestured toward the creek bank, where wild growth tangled green and silver in the sunlight. "The ones you've been using on me. I'd like to learn." She studied his face, looking for mockery. Found none. Just that strange intensity he carried with him everywhere, focused now entirely on her. "Why?" "Because you saved my life with them." He met her eyes straight on. "Seems like something worth knowing." Clara considered saying no, considered retreating to the cabin, to the safe distance she'd been keeping these past days. But his eyes held genuine curiosity, the kind she rarely saw in men, and she'd spent too many years being overlooked to turn away someone who actually wanted to listen. "All right," she said, "but pay attention. I don't intend to repeat myself." She taught him the way her mother had taught her hands in the dirt, names and uses braided together like thread. Mugwort. Clara pulled a stem, held it up so he could see the silvery underside of the leaves. They felt soft between her fingers, almost fuzzy, releasing their sharp green smell at her touch. Good for wounds and infections. You crush it into a paste with a little water. The smell tells you when it's ready bitter, like medicine ought to be. Eli took the stem from her hand. Their fingers brushed, brief and warm. He turned the plant over, studying it with the same careful attention he gave everything. "How do you know it's mugwort and not something that'll make things worse?" "The leaves." Clara knelt beside another clump, pointed to the distinctive shape. Damp earth soaked through her skirt at the knees, cool and rich-smelling. "See how they're cut, almost like feathers. And that silver-green color underneath. Nothing else around here looks quite like it." He knelt beside her. His shoulder was close to hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. Smell the wood smoke and sweat and something underneath that was just him. Clara stood up quick, moved to the next plant. "Yarrow." She kept her voice steady. "The white flowers. There. Good for fever, for bringing down swelling. You can steep it in hot water for tea, or wrap the leaves straight on the skin." Eli followed her, slower, his ankle protesting the uneven ground. But he didn't complain, just watched and listened, and asked questions that showed he was truly hearing what she said. "What about that one?" He pointed to a low-growing plant near the water's edge, its leaves broad and deep green, catching the light. "Dock." Clara crouched down, her reflection wavering in the creek beside her. The water was so clear she could see the pebbles on the bottom, brown and gold and gray. "Good for rashes, insect bites, that sort of thing. The root's the useful part, you have to dig for it." She pulled some leaves aside to show the thick root beneath. "But you've got to be careful. There's another plant looks similar, grows further from the water. That one will make you plenty sick." "How do you tell them apart?" "Practice." She let the leaves fall back into place, straightened up. Her knees ached from crouching. A reminder she wasn't as young as she used to be, though she wasn't old yet either. "My mama made me learn every plant in the woods behind our place. Tested me till I could name them with my eyes closed." Eli was quiet for a spell. When he spoke again, his voice had gone soft. "She sounds like a good woman." "Your mother?" Clara's throat tightened. She turned away, pretended to study a cluster of chamomile growing between two flat rocks. The little white flowers nodded in the breeze, cheerful and innocent. "She was practical," Clara said. "That's what kept us alive." They worked their way along the creek bank, Clara pointing out plants, Eli listening and learning. The sun moved across the sky, slow and warm. Shadows lengthened. The air grew cooler as the afternoon wore on, carrying the sweet smell of water and green growing things. Clara lost track of time, lost track of the careful distance she'd been keeping. There was something about teaching that opened her up, words flowing without the usual guards, her hands moving to show what her mouth described, and Eli listened, Really listened, not the way men usually did. Half their attention somewhere else, just waiting for their chance to talk. He took in every word, asked questions that proved he understood, stored each piece of information away like it mattered, like she mattered. The thought caught her off guard. She stumbled on a root, and Eli's hand shot out to catch her elbow warm and strong, steadying her before she could fall. "Careful there." Clara pulled away. Too quick. She saw something cross his face, surprise, maybe, or something that might have been hurt before he covered it over. "Thank you kindly." The words came out stiff. "I'm fine." They stood there, the creek singing between them, the afternoon light turning everything to gold. Clara could still feel where his hand had been, warm against her arm. "We should head back," she said, "before dark." Eli nodded, but he didn't move, just stood there, watching her with those gray eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to show. Clara. Her name in his mouth did something strange to her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She waited. "When I'm healed up," he said. "When I can walk proper again." He paused, swallowed. "I'll have to go." She'd known it was coming. Had been bracing herself for it since that first morning he'd woken up in the cabin. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the words in the warm afternoon air, made something twist beneath her ribs. "I know." She kept her voice flat. "Careful. You've got your own life to get back to." "Yes." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. Clara turned toward the cabin, took one step, two. "What about you?" Eli's voice stopped her. "Where will you go?" She didn't turn around. Couldn't. Crestwood. "I reckon. Find work there. A laundry, maybe, or a boarding house. There's always work for women who aren't afraid of hard labor. By yourself. That's how I got here. That's how I'll leave." Silence. The creek rushed on, heedless of them both. A fish jumped somewhere downstream, a silver flash and a splash. "It doesn't have to be that way." Eli's voice was barely louder than the water. "Alone, I mean." Clara's breath caught. She turned slowly, found him watching her with something raw and unguarded written plain across his face. "What are you saying?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. The openness vanished, so fast she almost thought she'd imagined it, replaced by his usual careful blankness. "Nothing." He looked away, toward the cabin. "Never mind. Forget I said anything." But Clara couldn't forget. Couldn't unknow the way he'd looked at her in that unguarded moment, like she was something worth having, something worth keeping. She walked back to the cabin without another word, her thoughts churning like the creek over its stones. At the door, she paused, turned. "Eli." He looked up from where he'd stopped by the woodpile. "That man who sent for me." "Mercer." Clara's voice held steady, but her hands trembled where they gripped her apron. "The station master said he's the wealthiest man in the territory. Hundreds of acres. Thousands of head of cattle." Eli's face went still as pond water. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked what I wanted from him." Clara met his eyes, held them. "I told you a roof, walls, somewhere to belong. I didn't know he was rich when I answered that advertisement. Didn't find out till I stepped off that train and the station master told me." She watched his face for something, anything. Found nothing but that careful emptiness. "Why does that matter?" "Because I want you to understand." Clara turned away, pushed the cabin door open. "Whoever ends up taking me in it won't be for money. It'll be for this." She gestured at the cabin, the creek, the herbs drying on the table inside. For somebody who sees me, not what they can get from me. She stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her, in the golden light of late afternoon. She heard Eli draw a sharp breath, heard him whisper something too quiet to make out something that sounded almost like a name that wasn't Eli. The storm came without warning. One moment, the evening sky was streaked with purple and gold, the air still and warm. The next, black clouds swallowed the canyon rim whole, and the air turned thick and charged, the kind of heaviness that pressed against Clara's ears and made the hair on her arms stand up. "Get inside!" Eli was already moving toward the door, his eyes on the sky. Now. They barely crossed the threshold before the first drops fell, fat and heavy, striking the roof like flung gravel. Then the sky split open, and water came down in sheets so thick Clara couldn't see the creek anymore. She stood at the window, watching the world disappear. Lightning cracked across the darkness, illuminating the canyon in frozen white flashes. The creek was rising. She could hear it even over the rain. The roar of water finding new paths, swallowing the banks where she'd knelt just hours ago teaching Eli about Yarrow and Doc. The roof began to leak almost at once. First one drip, then another, then a steady stream in the corner near the cot. Water running down the wall like tears. Clara grabbed the bucket, positioned it beneath the worst of the flow. Water splashed against wood, a hollow drumming beneath the thunder. Over here. Eli was dragging the cot toward the far wall where the roof seemed more solid, his bad ankle forgotten in the urgency. The cot leg caught on a raised board. He yanked. His foot slipped in the spreading puddle. He went down hard, knee cracking against the floor. Clara was beside him in 2 steps. "Let me—" "I've got it." He pushed himself up, face tight, and hauled the cot the rest of the way. Water was running in from 3 places now, maybe 4. The packed dirt floor was turning to mud, dark and slick, sucking at their boots. They worked without speaking. Clara gathered what she could save: the blankets, her valise, the precious herbs she'd spent days collecting. Eli wrestled the table away from a growing pool, stacked their remaining food on the highest shelf he could reach. His hands were shaking. Hers were too. Another leak opened in the roof. Then another. By midnight, the cabin had become a swamp. The corner near the hearth was the only spot still dry barely, a space maybe 4 feet square, pressed against the warm stones. Clara and Eli huddled there, backs to the wall. The single moth-eaten blanket stretched across both their shoulders. The fire had died when water found its way down the chimney, turning the coals to hissing black nothing. And now the darkness was complete, except when lightning split the sky. Clara's teeth chattered. Her dress was soaked from the waist down, heavy and cold against her legs, plastered to her skin. The smell of wet wool and mud filled her nose and beneath it, the sour smell of her own unwashed body. A week without a proper bath. A week in the same clothes. She'd stopped noticing it until now. She drew her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, tried to make herself small. This was what her life had come to. Crouching in a leaking shack in the middle of nowhere, covered in mud and creek water, shivering beside a man she didn't really know. No money, no prospects, no one in the world who knew or cared whether she lived or died. The woman who'd stepped off the train at Thornfield Station, clean dress, hopeful heart, letter clutched in her hand like a promise. That woman seemed like a stranger now. A fool. A child who'd believed that 47 words could change her life. Lightning flashed. In the brief white glare, Clara saw herself as if from outside, mud-streaked, shivering, pathetic. A stray dog looking for shelter. Her mother would be ashamed. The thought hit her like a slap. She pressed her face against her knees, hiding from the darkness, hiding from Eli, hiding from herself. "Clara!" His voice was barely audible above the rain hammering the roof. She lifted her head, found his face in the darkness, a pale shape. Nothing more. There's something I need to tell you. The words hung between them. Clara waited, her heart beating slow and heavy in her chest. I haven't been. He stopped, swallowed, started again. When you found me in that canyon, when you asked my name, I... Thunder exploded overhead. So close the whole cabin shook. The horse screamed outside, a sound of pure animal terror. Eli was on his feet before Clara could react, lurching toward the door. The horse, if she runs off. He threw the door open and disappeared into the wall of rain. Clara scrambled up, stumbled to the doorway. Lightning showed her the scene in frozen snapshots, Eli fighting through mud that sucked at his boots with every step. The horse rearing against her tether, eyes white with fear. Rain driving sideways in the wind, so thick it looked like smoke. She watched him grab for the reins, watched his boots slide in the muck, watched him go down. He fell hard, face first into the mud. The horse's hooves came down inches from his head, churning the ground to black soup. He rolled, came up on his hands and knees, mud coating his face, his hair filling his mouth. He spat, grabbed for the reins again. The horse reared. He held on. For a long moment it was just the two of them, man and beast. Locked in a battle, neither could afford to lose. Eli's bad leg buckled. He went down on one knee in the muck, sank past his ankle, but his grip on the reins didn't break. The horse screamed again, pulled, fought. Then something shifted. The animal's head dropped. Her sides heaved. She stood trembling, beaten down by the storm, and Eli pulled himself upright using the saddle for support. He led her to the lee side of the cabin, tied the reins to a post driven deep in the ground. His hand slipped twice on the wet leather. Mud ran down his face in dark streams, dripping from his chin, his nose, the ends of his hair. When he came back inside, he looked like something dragged up from the grave. Mud caked every inch of him, his clothes, his skin, the creases of his face. He stood in the doorway, water streaming off him in rivers. And for a moment he looked less like a man than something the earth had chewed up and spat out. Clara handed him the blanket. He took it, didn't wrap it around himself, just stood there holding it, dripping filth onto the floor, staring at nothing. What were you going to tell me? The question came out harder than she meant it to. Eli flinched like she'd struck him. Nothing. He turned away, moved toward the dry corner, leaving a trail of muddy footprints. It doesn't matter. It does matter. Clara, you were about to say something. She followed him, stood blocking his path to the wall. Rain drummed on the roof. Lightning flickered. Before the horse, before the thunder, you were going to tell me something. And I want to know what it was. Lightning flashed again. His face appeared in the white light, mud-streaked, exhausted, and something else. Something that looked like shame, burning so bright it hurt to see. Not tonight. His voice was barely a whisper. Please, not tonight. Clara studied him for a long moment, the mud in his hair, the tremor in his hands, the way he couldn't meet her eyes. She stepped aside. They didn't speak again that night. Clara curled into her corner, wet and cold and miserable. Eli sat against the opposite wall, the blanket draped over his shoulders, mud drying in cracks across his face. The storm raged on. But inside the cabin, a different kind of silence had taken hold. She must have slept, because she woke to stillness. The rain had stopped. Gray light seeped through the cracks, showing the ruin of their shelter mud everywhere. Standing water in the low spots, their belongings scattered and soaked. Eli was already up, already standing by the door, looking out at a world washed clean and new. He'd scraped most of the mud from his face, though traces still clung in his hairline, behind his ears. His clothes were stiff with dried dirt. "We need to go." Clara pushed herself upright. Every muscle ached. "Go where? Away from here." He didn't turn around. "This place won't make it through another storm, and there's somewhere—" He stopped, drew a breath. "Somewhere I need to take you." "Where?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scraped raw. "Trust me. Can you do that? Just trust me." Clara thought about the night before, the interrupted confession, the shame in his eyes. She thought about all the things she didn't know, all the questions he wouldn't answer. "Yes," she said. "I reckon I can." Something moved across his face, relief. Maybe, or resignation, or something too complicated to name. "Good." He turned back to the ruined cabin. "We leave soon as you're ready." The horse carried them both. Clara sat in front, her hands gripping the worn leather of the saddle horn. Eli sat behind her, one arm loose around her waist to keep her steady. His chest was warm against her back, solid and real through the damp fabric of their clothes. His breath stirred the hair at her temple with each exhale. They'd been riding for 2 hours. The canyon had given way to rolling hills, the hills to open grassland that stretched toward the horizon in waves of gold and brown and pale green. Clara had never seen so much empty space in all her life. In St. Louis, buildings crowded together like teeth in a jaw, blocking out the sky. Here, the sky went on forever blue and endless, with clouds piled up on the horizon like mountains made of cotton. The storm had washed the world clean. Everything smelled of wet earth and sage, fresh and sharp. "Where are we going?" She'd asked the question 3 times already. Each time, Eli had given the same answer. "You'll see." The 4th time, she stopped asking. The first rider appeared near midday. He came over a rise to the east, a dark shape against the bright sky, a young man on a paint horse, driving a small herd of cattle toward a fence line in the distance. Clara watched him notice them, watched him wheel his horse around, watched him ride closer with the easy seat of someone born to the saddle. Eli's arm tightened around her waist. She felt the change in him, the way his breathing shifted, the way his muscles went taut. The rider pulled up 20 feet away. Dust rose from his horse's hooves, caught the sunlight, settled slow. He pushed back his hat, revealing a sun-darkened face creased with surprise. "Mr. Mercer." He touched his hat brim, respectful. "We've been looking for you, sir. Whole outfit's been out searching since Tuesday last." Clara's spine went rigid. "Mr. Mercer." She turned her head, tried to see Eli's face. He wasn't looking at her. His jaw was set hard, his eyes fixed on the rider. "I'm fine, Tom. Had some trouble in the canyon. This woman here found me. Took care of me." The rider. Tom glanced at Clara. Curiosity flickered in his eyes. There and gone, quickly hidden behind the blank face of a man who knew better than to ask questions of his betters. "Yes, sir. Should I ride ahead? Let Mr. Dawson know you're coming in." "Do that." Tom touched his hat again, wheeled his horse, and took off at a gallop toward the horizon. Clara waited until he was gone, swallowed by the golden grass. "Mr. Mercer." The name fell between them flat and hard. Eli said nothing. His arm stayed around her waist, but it felt different now. Heavier. "That's what he called you. Mr. Mercer." Still nothing. Clara faced forward again, stared at the grassland stretching out before them, the distant line of fence posts, the smudge of buildings on the horizon that hadn't been there an hour ago. "You're going to explain," she said. Her voice came out steady, cold. "When we get wherever we're going, you're going to explain everything." "Yes." His voice was barely more than a breath against her hair. "I will." They passed 3 more riders before reaching the gate. Each one stopped. Each one touched his hat. Each one called him Mr. Mercer, or simply Sir, with the kind of deference that couldn't be learned or faked, the deference of men who depended on another man for their livelihood. Clara felt their eyes on her, curious, questioning, but nobody asked who she was. Nobody said a word beyond their greeting and their assurance that they were glad to see him safe. The buildings grew larger as they approached. What she'd taken for a single structure from far off turned out to be many a main house with a wraparound porch, a long bunkhouse with smoke rising from its chimney, a barn bigger than any building Clara had ever seen, stables, corrals, outbuildings she couldn't name, all of it spread across the landscape like a small town unto itself. And then she saw the gate. Massive posts of weathered oak, silver gray with age, with a crossbeam high overhead. Mounted on that crossbeam was a star 5 points, wrought iron, black against the blue sky. Star Ranch. Clara's hands went numb on the saddle horn. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel it pounding against her ribs, but everything else seemed very far away, like watching herself from a great distance, like a dream she couldn't wake from. The gate stood open. Beyond it, a packed dirt road led toward the main house 2 stories tall, white-painted rails along the porch, lace curtains in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. Red geraniums bloomed in boxes beneath the windows, bright as drops of blood. A home. A real home. The kind Clara had dreamed about in her narrow boarding house bed, back when she still let herself dream. The kind she'd imagined when she read and reread those 47 words. The horse stopped just inside the gate. An old man came running from the barn, white hair flying beneath a battered hat, weathered face creased deep by sun and wind, bow-legged gait of someone who'd spent 60 years in the saddle. He was shouting something, words Clara couldn't quite make sense of, and then he was at the horse's side, looking up at Eli with tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "Mr. Silas Sweet Mercy, we thought you was dead. Found your hat in that canyon. All that blood on the rock's been searching high and low for a week now." Silas. The name hit Clara like a bucket of cold water. She turned, looked at the man behind her, really looked, the way she should have looked from the very first day. His face had gone pale beneath the sunburn and the healing cuts. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. And his eyes, those gray eyes that had watched her so careful for a week now, were fixed on her face with something that looked like a man waiting for the axe to fall. Silas. The word came out wrong. Crooked. Not Eli. He didn't deny it. Silas Mercer. Her voice grew stronger, harder. Mercer. The man who wrote me those letters. The man who was supposed to meet me at the station. The old man, the foreman, she reckoned went quiet. His eyes moved between them, relief giving way to confusion. "Ma'am." Clara ignored him. She was sliding down from the horse now, her legs unsteady beneath her, her hands shaking as she gripped the saddle to keep from falling. Her boots hit the packed dirt. The ground felt too solid, too real. "You knew." She faced Silas, still mounted, still looking down at her with that terrible expression. "From the very beginning, you knew who I was?" "Yes." One word. No excuse, no explanation. "You let me think." Her voice cracked. She swallowed, started again. "You let me tell you everything. My mother, the letters, why I came west, all of it. And the whole time, you knew." "Yes." The foreman had backed away, was gesturing urgent to someone near the barn. Hands were gathering, faces appearing in doorways and around corners, drawn by the commotion. Clara didn't care. Didn't care who heard, who saw, who knew. I saved your life. The words scraped out of her throat like broken glass. I pulled you out of that canyon. I sat up all night when you were burning with fever. I gave you half my food when I was starving myself. And you... She stopped. Couldn't go on. The anger was choking her, rising up from somewhere deep. And underneath it was something worse, something that felt like grief. Silas swung down from the horse, slowly, carefully. His bad ankle nearly gave way when his boots hit the ground, but he caught himself on the saddle, straightened, faced her. I'm sorry. Sorry. The word tasted like ashes on her tongue. You're sorry. There's nothing I can say that will make this right. His voice was quiet, steady. The voice of a man who had made his choice and was prepared to face the consequences. I lied to you. I tested you. I let you believe I was somebody I wasn't, because I wanted to know what? He met her eyes, held them, whether you were real. He gestured at the house, the barn, the land stretching out in every direction, thousands of acres, thousands of cattle, a fortune in grass and water and sky. Whether you were different from the others, whether you came out here looking for me, or looking for all this. Clara stared at him. The anger was still there, hot and bright. But something else was pushing up beneath it. Something she wasn't ready to name. And what did you decide? The question hung between them. All around. The ranch had gone quiet, hands stopping their work. Faces turning toward the two figures standing in the shadow of the iron star. Silas's throat worked. He swallowed once, twice. You gave me half your cornbread when you thought I didn't have a dime to my name. His voice had dropped so low she had to strain to hear it. You taught me about plants like I was worth teaching. You sat with me through that storm when you could have stayed warm by what was left of the fire. He took a step toward her. She didn't back away. You asked me once what I wanted from the man who sent for you. I've thought about that question every single day since. He stopped. His hands hung at his sides, empty and open. And the answer is you deserve better. Better than a man who lies. Better than a man who tests people because he's too scared to trust them. Clara stood still as stone. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair, blew it across her face. She didn't brush it away. So you're sending me off? No. The word came out sharp, almost desperate. I'm telling you the truth. Finally. All of it. And then I'm asking you to choose. Choose what? Silas turned, pointed toward the house. That room on the second floor. The one with the windows facing east, where the morning light comes in first. I had it fixed up for you. For my bride. He paused. Drew a breath that shook on the way in. There's dresses in the wardrobe. Books on the shelves. Everything I could think of that a woman might want. He turned back to face her. It's yours if you want it. The room, the ranch, everything I have. But only if you want it. Only if you can find it in you to forgive a fool and a coward. The foreman had disappeared. The hands had drifted away, finding sudden pressing business elsewhere. It was just the two of them now, standing in the shadow of the iron star. The late afternoon sun painting everything gold and amber. Clara looked at the house, looked at the man, looked at the choice he was putting in her hands. I need time, she said finally. Time to think. Something flickered across Silas's face. Relief, fear, hope, all tangled together, impossible to separate. Take as long as you need. It might be a good while. I'll wait. Clara walked toward the house, her boots crunching on the packed dirt. At the porch steps, she stopped, turned back. Silas. He looked up. Those letters you wrote me. Those 47 words. She held his gaze, searching for the truth of him. Were any of them real? He didn't hesitate. Every last one. Clara studied his face for a long moment. Then she climbed the steps, crossed the porch, and disappeared through the door. The room smelled of lavender and lemon oil. Clara stood in the doorway, unable to move. The bed was made up with a white quilt, hand-stitched in a pattern of interlocking wedding rings, the same pattern her grandmother had sewn. Back in a time Clara could barely remember, a wardrobe of dark oak stood against one wall, its doors slightly open to show the edges of fabric inside calico, gingham, something that might have been blue silk. A washstand held a porcelain basin painted with tiny roses. A rocking chair sat by the window, positioned to catch the morning light. He'd prepared all of this for her, for a woman he'd never met. Mrs. Patterson, a sturdy woman with iron-gray hair pulled back tight and kind eyes set deep in a weathered face, had led her up the stairs without a word, had opened the door, stepped aside, and left Clara to face it alone. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she crossed to the window. The glass was wavy with age, distorting the view. But she could see the land rolling away toward the horizon. Fences, cattle moving in slow clusters across the grass, the glint of water where a creek wound through the pasture. His land, his cattle, his creek, his lie. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. What did she want? The question had followed her all the way from St. Louis. She'd told herself she wanted safety, a roof, walls, a place where she belonged. But standing in this room prepared for a woman who hadn't existed yet. A bride Silas Mercer had dreamed into being. She understood that she'd been lying to herself too. She wanted to matter, to someone, to anyone. And for 10 days in a leaking cabin, she had... The knock came an hour later. Clara had washed her face in the porcelain basin, the water cool and clean, smelling faintly of roses from the soap left beside it. She'd combed the tangles from her hair with a silver-backed brush she'd found on the dresser. Changed into one of the dresses from the wardrobe, a simple blue cotton. Nothing fancy, but clean and whole in ways her own clothes hadn't been in weeks. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. The face looking back was thinner than she remembered, older. But the eyes were the same her mother's eyes, dark and steady. Come in. The door opened. Silas stood on the threshold, hat in his hands. Still wearing the mud-stained clothes from the road, he'd washed his face and hands, but dirt still clung in the creases of his neck, beneath his fingernails. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. May I? Clara nodded. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, stood with his back against it, turning his hat in his hands, around and around. The silence stretched. You wanted an explanation, Silas said at last. A real one. Not what I said out there at the gate. Clara sat in the rocking chair by the window, folded her hands in her lap the way her mother had taught her. Waited. Silas moved to the center of the room. Stopped. His fingers worried at the hat brim, wearing it thin. 3 years back, a woman came to this ranch. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the floor, on a knot in the pine boards. Name was Catherine. She answered an advertisement. Same as you. Said all the right things. Smiled the right way. He paused. Swallowed. I married her inside a month. Thought I'd found... He stopped. Shook his head. Doesn't matter what I thought. What matters is that 6 weeks later she was gone. Took $2,000 from my safe and ran off with a gambler from Abilene. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. I sent men after her. They found her. Turned out she was already married, had been the whole time. The gambler was her husband. They'd been running the same game for years, moving territory to territory, ranch to ranch. Silas's jaw clenched. The hat brim crumpled under his grip. When your letter came, your first letter, I figured, here we go again. Another woman with a sad story and sweet words. He shook his head slowly. But something about the way you wrote, I couldn't stop puzzling over it. Couldn't stop wondering if maybe this time might be different. He looked at her then, finally. I was riding to meet you at the station. That's how I ended up in that canyon. I was on my way to you, Clara. And then the rocks came down, and when I woke up, I was there. You were there. His voice cracked on the words. And you didn't know who I was. Didn't know about the ranch or the money or any of it. You just saw a man who needed help. Clara stood, walked to the window, looked out at the fading light. So, you lied. I tested. The word came out bitter, aimed at himself. I told myself it was different, but it wasn't. I lied to you because I was scared. Because the last time I let myself trust somebody, she took everything I had and laughed while she did it. I'm not her. I know that. Silas moved closer, stopped when there was still space between them. I knew it that first night, when you sat up with me through the fever. I knew it when you gave me half your food. I knew it every single day. But I couldn't. His voice broke. Clara turned, saw the tears he was fighting to hold back, the way his whole body trembled with the effort of keeping himself upright. I couldn't make myself tell you, because as long as I didn't say the words, I could keep pretending. Pretending you might still choose me when you found out. Pretending I hadn't already ruined everything. The silence that followed was different from before. Softer, somehow. The anger was still there in Clara's chest. She could feel it, coiled tight beneath her ribs. But something else was rising alongside it. Understanding. Or the beginning of it. You should have told me, she said quietly. That first morning, when you woke up and saw me. I know. You should have trusted me. I know. I don't know if I can forgive you. Silas nodded. His cheeks were wet now, tears cutting tracks through what remained of the dust. I know that too. Clara looked at him, really looked. At the lines around his eyes, deeper than they'd been a week ago. At the gray coming in at his temples. At the weariness that went deeper than exhaustion. The weariness of a man who had built an empire and still felt poor. Who had everything the world could offer and trusted none of it. A man who was terrified she would walk away. The cornbread, she said. He blinked. Ma'am. In the cabin. When I broke it in half and gave you the bigger piece. Clara's voice was steady now. Certain. You looked at it like nobody had ever given you anything before. Silas's throat moved. He didn't speak. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Not wrong with you, wrong with your life. Something had happened to make you forget what simple kindness looked like. She crossed to him, stopped an arm's length away. I came out here looking for a roof and 4 walls. That's what I told myself. But that's not why I stayed in that canyon. Not why I carried you to the cabin, or sat up through the fever, or taught you about plants down by the creek. Then why? The question was barely more than a breath. Clara reached out, took the ruined hat from his hands, set it on the bed. Because you needed somebody, and I was there. The porch faced west. Clara sat in a wooden chair, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky had turned to watercolors, orange and pink and purple. Colors she'd never seen in St. Louis, where smoke and soot dulled everything to gray. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass, its evening song clear and sweet. Silas stood a few feet away, leaning against a post. He hadn't spoken since they'd come downstairs. Neither had she. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was the silence of two people learning each other's rhythms, figuring out how to share space. "I lied to you," Silas said finally. "Yes. I don't have any words that can make it right." "No." The sun touched the horizon. Golden light spilled across the grassland, painting the world in shades of honey and amber. Somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered. A cowbell clanked in the distance, peaceful and familiar. "I need time," Clara said, "to figure out whether I can trust you, to sort out what I want." Silas nodded. "However long you need. It might be weeks, might be months. I'll wait." Clara looked at him, at the lines of his face, softened by the dying light, at the hope he was trying so hard to keep hidden. "That room upstairs, the one you fixed up." "Yes. You said it has everything a woman could want. Everything I could think of." Clara turned back to the sunset. The colors were deepening now, orange fading to rose, pink darkening to purple. "It doesn't have the most important thing." Silas went still. "What's that? Trust." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "That's the one thing you can't buy or build or set out pretty on a shelf. It has to be earned." She stood, walked to the porch rail, rested her hands on the smooth wood, still warm from the day's sun. "But I'm willing to give it a chance to grow." She looked over her shoulder at him. "If you are." Silas straightened, took a step toward her, stopped. "I am—" 2 words. 47 had brought her here. 2 might be enough to make her stay. Clara turned back to the sunset. The last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky began its slow turn toward night. A single star appeared in the east, the first star of evening, bright and steady. Starlight. Star bright, she thought, and almost smiled at the memory. Her mother, standing at the window of their tiny room, teaching Clara the old rhyme. Behind her, she heard Silas move to the rail, felt him stand beside her close, but not touching. They watched the stars come out together, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds waiting to grow. Clara thought about her mother, about providence and second chances, about cornbread shared in hard times, and kindness given without expecting anything in return. She thought about 47 words on a yellowed piece of paper, and a man who'd written them meaning every one. Not forgiven. Not yet. Maybe not for a good while yet. But here, both of them, choosing to stay. And for now, for tonight, that was enough. The end. I wrote this story thinking about my grandmother. She used to say that the truest measure of a person shows itself when nobody's watching, when there's nothing to gain. When the only witness is your own conscience and the good Lord above. Clara gave half her cornbread to a stranger she believed had nothing. Silas learned that the treasure he'd been hunting for had nothing to do with land or cattle or money in a safe. Maybe that's what we're all looking for, when you get right down to it. Somebody who sees us for who we really are and stays anyway. If you found something familiar in these pages, something that reminded you of your own road toward trust and belonging, then this story did its work. Thank you kindly for walking this path with me. Disclaimer. This story is inspired by classic Western tales of the American frontier and was created solely for entertainment purposes. The narrative does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters, names, locations, and events depicted herein are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or to actual events is purely coincidental and entirely unintentional.